Hello. Hi, everybody. We are so happy for you to be back on another episode with Point of View podcast. As you know, I'm Obel, and today this episode is going to be so much more interesting for me because we're going to dig deeper into the psychological issues that goes on and the systemic racism that's happening right now in our country and how we can manage it and how can we move forward. But if you guys watch our last episode, you know that we had former police officer Antonio who kind of told us the ugly truth about what goes on in the police system. And along with him today is going to be a clinical social worker, and I'm excited for her to be with us today. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce them. We do have both of them sitting with us, and I'm excited for them to be a part of this episode and to kind of dig deeper into our issues that we're having or currently facing in our country. And so I will have them have the floor. I'll start with you, Antonio. You give us, a little background about who you are again, and then we'll go ahead and with Shaquita.
Well, thank you for having me back. I started out in law enforcement a long time ago, back in the 80s, and I spent 20 years in law enforcement, and I retired, I thought, for good. But then I got back into it and did another 5 years here in Texas. I did 20 years as a municipal police officer in the Northeast, and I can't tell you any more than that, remember, because I don't want people to try to pinpoint exactly the community I policed in based on the things that we talk about. It's something that I've been very passionate about since I was a teenager. And actually, everything that's going on and the reason why we're sitting down having this conversation, I've been waiting for this literally for decades.
Wow.
So I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And we do have this beautiful young lady. Well, I should say young lady because you still look young, whatever your age is. I'm not going to put you out there. Shaquita Gibson, thank you so much for being on. And can you tell us a little bit more about you and tell our audience, special things about you and what makes you so passionate about this topic?
Sure. Well, Bella, first I want to thank you for inviting me here. Definitely feel privileged. Again, my name is Shaquita. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And what that is that I provide mental health services to people that may be struggling with anxiety, depression, or other challenges. I also have a background in education. I'm a former educator for 11 years. And I'm very passionate about helping people. And that's how I essentially got involved in this type of work. Kind of growing up, I'm a 70s baby. And so at the time that I was growing up, I dealt with a lot of backlash due to affirmative action. I tended to attend primarily white schools. And so issues that deal or pertain to race are very important to me and I'm very passionate about. And so just one last note, and so I'm also currently in the process of doing some research on prison reentry programs. And so my research for my doctoral program emphasis is race and incarceration, and so that's pretty much why I'm here.
Thank you so much. That was such a beautiful introduction. I couldn't say it better. And guys, if you guys can hear in the background, we do have some protesters outside. We're in Dallas, and this is so relevant. It's kind of like emotional at the same time. But we do have protesters in the back screaming Black Lives Matter, and as we do know. But as you guys know already, on our podcast, The Point of View, we like to do a quote of the week so that we can reflect on it and we can kind of share our thoughts. And today, our quote of the week says, "Racism is a psychological warfare. Racists try to manipulate us and change our behavior by creating hate, discrimination, and division in society. Rise above the fray," says Carlos Wallace. What do you guys think about that quote?
So it kind of reminds me of the many conversations that we've had actually trying to define racism. And I do have a definition, a working definition, is that right?
Yeah,
So-
go ahead.
Okay, working definition. However, when we're ready, I'll share a story that will describe, I think, systemic racism better than me just simply defining it.
Okay.
But it is something, I'll be honest with you, I am surprised that more people who are black and brown can't really understand or identify racism,
Wow.
and in particular the younger generation. And I think they can be educated on this. And I think part of the reason why they don't understand it is because we have not spent the time to educate people on racism. What does that mean in the history of racism, particularly in this country?
Right, right. Thank you. Would you want to add to that,
Well,
Shaquita?
definitely. Just to add my just short point that, when you mentioned that racism is, psychological warfare, I can definitely agree to that because from a mental standpoint, if you can, control someone's mind or control someone's thinking, in a sense, that can be something that can be, passed on, generationally. Because people tend to pass on the beliefs and the perspectives of those that, do the controlling. So I definitely agree with that.
Wow. Yes, definitely. And Antonio, I do have a question for you. For someone who's been in the force for so long, right now there are a lot of people chanting, outside of Black Lives Matter to defund the police, and because of what all that's going on, do you both feel like it's necessary? I'll start with you, because you've been in the force for so long. Do you feel like that's something that is necessary for us to kind of start with that change when it comes to systemic racism?
I think that's just the beginning. The issues are so broad, so it is not something where you can do one thing. There's no app for this. We don't hit like one button and it just gets better.
Okay.
We're talking about something that really started 400 years ago.
Wow.
So what will it take to start to unravel a system that started 400 years ago, and that's really been going strong ever since? So defunding, to me, means that you take money away from, law enforcement, but we also should be looking at the entire criminal justice system,
Okay.
not just from law enforcement.
Right.
That's just a really almost, it's an important part, but it is not as big a part of the entire system as we may think. So prisons, courts.
Right.
There are a lot of different parts of the criminal justice system, and if we just look at defunding the police, I think we're missing the point.
Wow. Wow, well said. And I do know that right now it's so sad to say that with all of this that's going on, that a police officer had the audacity to even, murder another, person of color, or I should say another Black person. And, now that all of this is happening and, they finally, I should say, he got his charges, he was charged with felony assault, or, the proper term. But do you guys think that all police officers should kind of also get that same, or should be, how should I say, charged, or should also be punished, that's the word, for their wrongful death, or for wrongful death in our community? Do you think that they should also, like the other officers that's been, involved in other crimes, should they also get that consequence? Should they pay for their actions in the same way? What's your thought on that? Because
I did the job for a long, long time,
yeah,
and I pulled my gun out a lot. I pointed my gun at people a lot. I had guns pointed at me. And I'm not saying that every police officer should do it quite this way, but even when someone pulls a gun on you, it still may not be the right time to shoot someone, believe it or
Yeah,
not. And it's a very technical thing. But I'll say this, to answer your question directly, yes, police officers have to be held accountable for their actions.
okay,
There are rules of engagement, if you will, and I'm using that term because this is almost like warfare, it seems, right? And so police officers are taught when to use force, when to use deadly force, when it is legal to do it. But then there's also the moral question. When I had guns pointed at me, legally I could have shot them dead. But morally, it wasn't the right thing to do because I thought still in the moment I had other options.
wow,
And because of the way I valued life, at the time, it did not seem like it was the right thing to do.
Okay.
But police officers have to follow the law,
Yeah.
right? So they can't just go out and shoot people, and it is not as, let's put it this way. When you're taught how to use or when to use deadly force, it's pretty clear. You can't get through the academy
Okay.
without understanding the law on deadly force. But what we're seeing is something different. What we're seeing with these deadly shootings has nothing to do with better training or not understanding the law.
Right, right. And, for a clinical, social worker, do you believe that the police are actually, how they are handling that? Can you tell me if you think there is a psychological problem that's probably going on within them, or is it just plain racism? And also, do you think that the ones that are, with all that's going on, how are police officers handling that, with the protests and the good ones, or, the people that have the good morals, the police officers that do have the good morals? How is that, how is that looking psychologically for them?
Can I take that first part? That's a very complex question when you ask about, the underlying roots of it, because, ultimately we can't ignore the role that, negative characterization plays, and we can't undermine the role of, racism and its social and cultural influence in terms of our values and our beliefs. And so when you have people that have been socialized, in a sense, to a Eurocentric perspective, Eurocentric values, Eurocentric culture, and when you think about historically how we've been viewed in this country, Black people have been portrayed as being criminals,
right,
and very animalistic in a sense in terms of our perceptions. And unfortunately, those things tend to get passed down from generation. Policies don't necessarily change people's perspectives, and change doesn't happen overnight. So I definitely think that, culture plays a part in, how those interactions play out. And just to also add this next piece in terms of what Antonio was saying, there is a need for, increased accountability. And about the question about defunding the police, he's right, it's a start. But when you think about the bigger problem, there are so many other areas that need to be addressed. And definitely our prisons is a good place to start when you're thinking of the economics of it and how much money is kind of funneled into our prisons versus how much money is funneled into our police departments in terms of where you can make the biggest impact and change. Wow. Definitely.
And if I can just say something about the
Sure.
economic part of this. I spent 20 years as a municipal police officer and had a really good pension at the end of 20 years. And a pension in this case means that the city will give me a check every month
Right,
for the rest of my life.
right.
There's no account like a 401k. It won't run out.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about $10,000 a year. I'm talking a pretty decent amount of money that I get from the city for life.
Wow.
So there are some great economic incentives for keeping a system like this going.
Yeah.
Wow, this is pretty interesting. I want to dive into statistics. According to NAACP, we see that out of 6.8 million correctional population, the Black incarcerated are 5 times more than white, and we see with Blacks and Hispanics they take up 32%. Of the U.S. population, but yet they take up 56% in the in the jail or prison system. And it's sad to say that even if they were incarcerated at the rate of white males or white people, the prison or the jail population would have decreased by about 40%. That statistics is pretty ugly because it's like it shows you point blank the racism that goes on within those systems. And how do you think that has impacted our community, our Black community specifically?
Can I take that one?
Yes, of course. This is for you,
I
Shaquita.
love that. There's a lot there.
Well, we know that when you look at statistics that, report that, 1 in 3 Black males will have spent some time in their lives in prison, that's a significant percentage. And so when you think about that many number of Black men entering our jails and prisons, and when you think about what happens in prison in terms of the violence, in terms of the disparate conditions, what tends to happen is that, prisons tend to become the institutions of socialization in our community, if that makes sense. So when you have that many people entering, you can have someone who has a father, a brother, an uncle, a cousin that's all been incarcerated.
Yeah.
So what tends to happen is, when people leave prison, they bring those values and norms that are associated with prison back to the community. Right. And we know that that's dysfunctional. And a lot of times they bring the psychological, in a sense, the toll and the impact with them.
Yeah.
And so it affects communities in that they're not prepared to, in a sense, integrate into their families, to take on the roles that they, may have previously had as a father, as a husband, as a son, and to do that effectively and to be able to function with the current challenges that they face with just, in a sense, acclimating back to being in the community. So it definitely has a disparate impact on our community.
Would you like to add to that?
Because
I have another question that follows up with.
The thought that goes, as you were speaking, I have so many thoughts going through my mind. And one is that this is such an old problem.
Right.
We've been in chains for a long, long time. And it's not a coincidence that we have about 2 million people who are incarcerated in this country. I think we are the highest for any industrialized country.
Yes.
And you may know better than me, or you may have seen some recent stats on people who are still owing time to the system. So 2 million may be incarcerated. However, I think it's somewhere around 4 to 6 million that are still involved with the criminal justice system.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a significant number of largely men, but don't forget also that we have a significant number of women also doing time.
And it's sad to say, obviously it's obvious that it's more Black women doing time than white women. Do you guys think that it has something to do with court-appointed lawyers? Do you feel like that hinder us? Does it hinder the Black community? Do you feel like, I know probably a lawyer will probably have to come on this podcast and give me a little bit more detail on that, but do you guys, this is just something that I've been inquiring, so.
No, it's not. There are a lot of things that happened before that.
Okay.
It started in 1619.
Okay.
When they brought the first 20 to 30 Africans here to this continent to start American slavery, right? So when you have a system that you put in place, and the system means that things are going to work a certain way.
Right.
Right? So we don't need to spend a whole lot of time understanding what is, conceptualize what a system means in this case. It means this is the way it works, right?
Yeah.
And so we have not been able to, even the Civil War, where we lost about 660,000 Americans, they killed each other to keep the system going.
Wow.
This is how one side was so intent on keeping this going that they sacrificed about 330,000 of their men, countless others who were injured permanently. And the system did not end then, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the Civil War. A lot of people like to think that was such a long time ago. Man, that slavery thing, such a long time ago. Right after the Civil War ended, they put in place another system. They said, well, we can't have slavery. So we're going to give you this other thing. And this other thing is where I think a lot of people have a hard time understanding. So slavery seems like it was so long ago. This other thing could not have been that bad. Not as bad as slavery. But that's why we're talking about this in 2020, because indeed it was bad, arguably just as bad as slavery. The only difference is that you had a little bit more freedom, but as we just talked about stats, 2 million people still incarcerated, and maybe 4 to 6 million who are still on paper in this country. And if you look at wealth, as brown and Black people in this country, we are about 100 to 150 years behind in terms of where we should be when we talk about wealth. That's another program, though.
Right. Definitely. Wow. Thank you for diving into that. But now the problem is, they are, like you said, it is a system that is forcing them to kind of still be in chains, and we're not free mentally because this is still affecting us in our communities. And now systemic racism, I don't know, what would it look like individually and, in our families or in our communities? Would you like to tell us about how that can impact us psychologically? Like, systemic racism is so big, it's pretty much spread out everywhere in our lives, and it affects us individually, it affects us in our families, Black families, in the community. So how would you see that,
To set this up for you, like we had talked about, do you mind if I share my story now?
Yes, I think you should definitely share your story.
Okay.
Yes,
All right.
definitely. We're all ears.
So I kind of thought about that. When you say, hey, let's do another one, as soon as you said, let's do another one, I started to think about what I need to really, I have a lot of things, we all have a lot of things that happen to us throughout our lives. And it's hard to pinpoint those moments when it's more critical than any other moment.
Yeah.
But I want to share with you something that happened 16 years ago. And I started to think about this more and more in preparing for this podcast today. And so my family and I had just moved to Texas. We've been here a couple of years. Just to give you a little background, I was married to someone who is a nurse. She got her nursing degree. Right out of nursing school, she went into ICU, the intensive care unit, which is like a nurse, like a police officer coming out of the academy and going into SWAT. It's just not something that you do very often, right? So in other words, she had to be very capable, right? Moved to Texas. She did adult ICU, where we moved from. Moved to Texas. She did pediatric ICU. And she got recognized for her good work. So there was a newsletter and with her picture in it, my daughter, and they would post that. And some of her coworkers would tear that down. She found notes about immigration and Negro jokes. This is in a Texas hospital.
Right.
And so she said to herself one day, why don't I invite some of my coworkers over to my home?
Get to know me a little bit.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we did that and provided dinner. And about a week later, we got a letter in the mail that I would love to share with you.
Wow.
I have to put my specs on.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Please share it.
And it said, I have a copy of it here too. So there's a real letter. You need to stop all illegal activities. Now, they were aware that I had just retired from a career in law enforcement.
Okay.
They knew she, obviously, is a nurse, right? A policeman's salary and a nurse's salary does not justify your lifestyle. You and your family better watch your back, you niggers.
Wow.
Welcome to Texas.
Wow.
That was our welcome. So I called the police. I get an officer who showed up. And when we shared the letter with him, he kind of like smirked. And at that point, I wasn't in a smirking mood.
Yeah.
And so he did a report. I'd like to share a little bit about what he said in his report. It won't take me very long, just a couple of sentences. So I made contact with Antonio's wife, who stated that she was working at the Children's Hospital and that a racially motivated letter was left in a nurse's station, and she is the only African-American female that works there. Antonio seems to believe that it possibly could be a coworker of his wife, the one who sent the letter, you think?
Wow.
After sharing that she had experienced some things at work,
Yeah.
weeks later I get a call from the investigator, who I swear to you talked down to me. He talked to me like instead of doing 20 years in law enforcement, I had just done a 20-year bid.
Oh my God.
In prison.
It's like okay, so did he know you were a police officer?
Yes,
Okay.
because the other officer put it right in the report.
Wow.
And so I wasn't really feeling it, so I went down to the police department to be heard. And I had a very, let's say, spirited conversation with the supervisor while the investigator was in that same space and could hear me, because I was not going to allow that investigator to talk to me that way.
That way, right.
So we asked that they dust for prints, do an investigation. They did not contact anyone at the hospital. They did not dust for prints because you would see it on the letter. So we had this was brought to her manager's attention.
Yeah.
It was brought to the police department's attention. And when we talk about systemic, I thought this was an example of what we meant by systemic. It is a part of everything that we do.
Yeah.
This is a hospital system,
Yeah.
takes care of our kids, in this case, takes care of us as adults. And these are some of the folks that are working there. In the police department, someone with my background to be treated the way I was treated, I can only imagine how other people are treated as well.
Exactly.
So I have to share one thing, this last thing, where I asked my ex for this because I didn't have this, so she texted me, hope she doesn't mind me sharing this. Said, believe it or not, this action of taking pictures and sending it made me cry. I felt traumatized all over again.
Yeah. It's very powerful.
This is so sad. I don't even know how to even address that right now. Yeah.
You know, Antonio provided a perfect example of systemic racism. And so ultimately, you know, what systemic racism is the practices, the policies that tend to privilege whiteness and to disadvantage underrepresented racial groups. So what tends to happen is that, you know, this is trickled down to the criminal justice system, you know. And so in his case, the unspoken practices is that, you know, we don't take these type of reports seriously.
Yeah.
And so on a personal level, you know, it makes it difficult to keep asking for help when the help isn't really there. And so you mentioned the part about wanting to connect the psychological with, you know, the systemic racism.
Yeah.
Well, you know, the psychological piece is the trauma. You know, oftentimes when we speak of racism, we look at it as a thing or an act, but we don't think of it as traumatizing.
Right.
That, you know, racism can be hostility, racism can be violence, whether it be psychological violence, whether it be verbal violence or physical violence, it's still traumatizing. And so often we get so accustomed to experiencing this type of trauma, and it happens so frequently because it is systemic, it just makes it difficult to confront that, you know, as an individual, you know, in a healthy way. So oftentimes we do shut down. And we find other ways to deal with it, whether it be internalizing it, trying to deal with it within our own families. But I think that was a great example of, you know, what it looks like on an individual level. And on a community level, when you mentioned that part, what it looks like is that people stop reaching out for help when they need it. You know, one frequent complaint, or if you will, that I frequently hear about people in the Black community is they don't call the police, they don't report things.
I was going to go right back to that because I actually had a similar incident that I will not get into because this is not about me. I want you guys to really kind of express more about it. And I think that's very important because now in our community, it's a lot of people like, you know, even in movies, they joke about it, but it's a real thing. You don't call the police if you need help. You just handle it yourself.
Exactly.
And it's like, the reason behind it is not just a Black thing. It's really the systemic racism that we've been dealing with for so many years, where if you are asking for help as a civilian, you feel like you don't even have the right to be protected the way you should be.
Exactly.
Because of your skin. And it's just so sad and it's very sick to me. It's extremely sick. And it's now what I'm really curious about, have you dealt with men that's been incarcerated and you see how the system is set up when they come out, it's less likely for them to have a job. You know, even if they're innocent, they've dealt with so much trauma inside or outside or from, during their time, when they come out, it's like, how are they able to function normally and, in that environment where, okay, am I welcome? Because now I don't even have the right to vote. I don't have the right to kind of, find a normal, decent job to provide for myself, or if I have a family that needed my help, all of that. How does that, play a role into how our community is kind of, it's not really growing, but how is that, how you feel like this is affecting them personally? And how, have you dealt with that in a clinical setting? How does that look like? Because I know there can also develop some psychological issues, while they're in there. So how does that look like?
Well, what it looks like is that, you're absolutely correct. When people are released from prison, they face difficulties with kind of reintegrating due to felony disenfranchisement, policies. And so it makes it difficult for people to be able to rent. It makes it difficult for people to obtain employment because of the stigma of incarceration. And, when you add into that, the racism part of it, in terms of the negative characterizations. And the reason why I reference particularly Black males is that 93% of people incarcerated are men.
Right.
So although women do face these challenges as well, there are more men that are being released from prison. And so you have the race aspect of it where, when you go out and apply for jobs, the reality is that, people tend to hire people that look like them. People tend to promote people that look like them. And if you don't look like them, then you're not really in a position to where you can take advantage of the same opportunities. And then you have the stigma of incarceration over you on top of that. So it makes it very difficult. So I have to kind of look at this from a different standpoint, in that what it looks like for Black males is different than what it looks like for white males. And that's important because oftentimes when Black males are released back to the communities, people are released back to broken communities that don't necessarily have the resources to provide them the support they need. Not saying that, there aren't, white men who have fallen victim to incarceration that are from impoverished communities, but when you look at the family dynamic, the network and the support that's available, it's different.
Right.
So it makes it more difficult, and it's more psychologically distressing for people that encounter that type of discrimination and have to deal with that stigma to try to, in a sense, create a life for themselves with absolutely very little support or help.
Right. And that's why you can see that they're most likely to become homeless, 10 times more likely to be homeless as Black males. And also I feel like they kind of walk with that anger, internalized anger. It's just plays a role, all of that mentally. And sometimes you think, okay, their behavior into the society. Let's say someone was innocent, they'd be in prison, and they come out and they have that psychological distress. And sometimes what hurts the most is that they're not even able to reach out for mental health professionals to kind of help them out, because it's like, what's the point of life? Because now I'm just back into a society where I'm not able to even function properly. And you see that, I don't remember his name. Oh Lord, I should have searched this. But the guy who hung himself when he refused to sign a plea deal, and then when he went back, I think that was in New York. I'll put the name if it'll come back to me. And he went back home and he hung himself. Because it's like he's been in there and he was innocent. He refused to sign the plea deal and he had to serve time. And when they finally released him, he had to hang himself because it was.
I think I remember that case out of New York.
Yeah,
Yes.
It was in New York. It was a crazy case. Now, I know you mentioned you was also in education, which is also pleasant, because now I feel like this question would be extremely interesting. How are we, I think we just watched a video prior to this podcast of a 6-year-old who got arrested with a zip, I forgot what it's called. But she was having a temper tantrum, and the school system apparently called the police, and the police came, and she was, quietly, I guess according to the video, she was sitting quietly by the time they arrived, and they still put her in handcuffs and just said if she was even, older, she would have been in normal handcuffs. So it's like, and now how do you trust your teachers and school system to kind of teach your kids about racism when this is happening? And I don't know what you think. Is that even legal for you to call the police on a 6-year-old girl, like a 6-year-old period.
So I'll take the legal part if you don't mind first.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So yes, in that particular instance, and that was a Florida case, I recall. Right?
Yes, it was in Florida, Orlando, Florida.
The state of Florida, now remember this is Florida, gave, the legislature gave law enforcement officers permission to arrest kids that young.
This is
In Texas,
insane.
you can arrest kids as young as 10.
Okay.
So 10-year-old can be placed in handcuffs if the officer believes it's necessary. Now, you're not going to go to an adult jail, but the fact is that it's still an arrest, right? So the report is going to be a little different, but it's still an arrest report. And I was a school resource officer for a few years, and I'll be honest with you, I arrested probably on average about 8 students a year, so probably about 24 kids under the age of 14 that I arrested because the state of Texas told me I had to.
And that's something that's, so do you want to address the psychological aspect of that, and how does that play, how do the teachers now go and tell their, how are they teaching in school about racism? If you have a white teacher now telling your black child, how racism works, or are they even telling them about, what racism is really about? And I know our school system is not really teaching our kids about African American history to begin with. So, or is, at least if they are, it's an elective. So what exactly are, how does that even play? I mean, how can we change that? How do you see that getting better?
Well, just to address the first part, so when you mention the part about, teaching about racism, when you think about that, is racism being taught? And so when I was in school, let me just say this, our educational system right now that's been in place has been pretty much the same for the past 100 years, 100 to 150 years. And so when you think about the curriculums that are in place, a lot of those curriculums have been, in a sense, influenced by the Old South and by those that wanted to keep in place the Old South. And so what tends to happen is that our educational curriculum tends to be very Eurocentric focused. So it focuses on Eurocentric, leaders, policies, values, and perspectives. And so those things tend to get reinforced. Okay. And so from a psychological standpoint, it's difficult, especially, as an early age when there are not, when there's not a culture per se that is, or a perspective or an identity that is displayed in, and I'll say an accurate light, if I'll say that. And so when you think about, school curriculums, it tends to kind of promote this sense of, and I know this may be somewhat kind of harsh the way I'm saying it, but kind of white pride. It tends to promote that to a degree. And so it makes it difficult for people that, may be brown or black to find a sense of identity in that when they're missing from that story, or when the story is told or the history is provided in such a limited way, if that makes sense. And so there's not a balance to that. When you think about, Black history being an integral part of American history and how our country was founded and how we've come to have this democracy today, we've been a very instrumental part of that. And so for us not to have that focus in the curriculum and for us to be able to see ourselves in the curriculum, it makes it difficult to have that sense of identity and that sense of pride. And honestly, to have that sense of esteem about it,
What comes to mind also is in the Black and brown community, when it comes to mental health, we're told to suck it up.
Yeah.
That mental health, seeking mental health services is for white people, let's be honest. That's Black and brown folks, we don't do that.
Right. Go ahead.
It's interesting that you say that. I know I may be kind of going off grid a little bit, but, when I think about our position historically in this country, when we've, in a sense, attempted to petition or protest for our rights, the response has generally been that we just don't appreciate what we have. And so in a sense, we've been told to kind of suck it up and deal with it. So this isn't something that, from a cultural perspective within our community, I believe that, originated, I believe because of our standing in this country and our continuous plights at equality. And, we get a step forward in the message or the message that's in a sense kind of, reinforced is that we're asking for too much. You have enough, be satisfied. And so when you think about it, we're kind of taught, not really taught, but kind of conditioned in a sense that you got to deal with it. And in the sense we had to,
Right.
when you think about the types of circumstances, African American people have had to deal with, for lack of a better phrase, you didn't have time to be depressed. You didn't have time to be depressed.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we are kind of seeing the consequences of that.
Yeah. And to kind of go into detail, I remember you mentioned on our last podcast, how we can kind of help with active shooters, and you see how they handle that situation when it comes to, most of the active shooters that have been, shooting into schools, they're white, and when they face with the consequences, they're probably sick, they're mentally ill. And if, let's say, that were to happen to a black person, it would have been totally different. We've been seen as animals, and it would be like, oh my gosh, this person has a bad behaviors. So, how do you want to elaborate on how you would see that kind of take a shift into, how would that change? Or how would you see change in that area when it comes to, active shooters?
In
In
terms
schools.
in terms of how we view them?
Yes, how we view
based
them.
on their race?
Right.
So,
I don't want to interrupt you. Go ahead.
go ahead. You're itching.
You're itching, I can tell.
No. I wasn't going to
Scratch that
address.
itch.
I wasn't going to address the active shooter part. But when you think about the negative the stigmatization of people in our community, when you look at people that have historically used crack cocaine, were criminalized, whereas people that are caught up in the opioid crisis, were people that needed help. And so when you think about crime in impoverished communities, predominantly black communities or minority communities, when children get killed, that doesn't become necessarily a national crisis. Whereas, when we think about school shootings, then we have our gun legislation proposals, and we have more of a national outcry for attention. And so I think that, when you were mentioning the part about how do we change that, I think, was that the question? In terms of addressing it, in terms of how do we change that?
Right.
I think we're already starting to change that. And I think, what's happening currently is speaking to the times, and that when you think about people, us as a human, I guess, human race, in the past we didn't have that compassion for people that were victimized or people that were killed, but now I'm seeing more of an acknowledgement that we're human beings in a sense. So it's not just this person's a criminal. And we do have those, people in our society that will tend to take, for example, George Floyd, want to focus on some type of criminal background, or Ahmaud Arbery want to focus on some type of criminal background. But this is about human beings.
Right.
And I think that, in this space that we're in right now, we have the opportunity to have the conversation so we can take control of the narrative and change that, if that makes sense.
Definitely. And now you have the floor.
I'm sorry.
So, I learned something.
Yeah, I love it.
So, we're going to talk about that R word, racism,
Yes.
right? So what we're really talking about is how do you change people who were taught or conditioned to view people that look like the folks in this room a certain way. I can't remember who said this, but ain't nobody got time for that. I tell you what, I am getting exhausted. I don't know about you guys,
Yeah.
but I have to do a lot of explaining.
Right.
Okay?
Go
And
ahead,
so,
brother.
I'm interested in the people who are willing or who understand that it's wrong, that they don't have to be taught or told it's wrong, and people that we can partner with. And there are plenty of people that we can partner with, by the way, who get it.
Yeah.
And we see them out there protesting, and you know, I work with them politically, so they're there. Now, when it comes to the active shooter, I always have to bring some bad news.
Go ahead. We're here
So-
to handle it all.
There was a time when we believed that everyone walked around with a gun, right? We watched movies when we were growing up. Maybe not so much you. They changed.
Okay.
And so there were, you know, cowboys and Indians, right? And so, of course, the Indian was a bad guy, by the way. And people walked around, white males, walked around with guns. That's not true. That's Hollywood. So there weren't all these guns and people walking around, you know, like a cowboy all day long.
Wow.
In many cases, if you went to a small town
Right.
or a town, you had to check your gun with the sheriff. And so we think that guns have been around. It's just part of our culture and the numbers that we have them today. There wasn't that long ago when there was this little gun called a Saturday Night Special. And it was a revolver with a 2-inch barrel, was a snub nose, so it's easy to conceal. And that was like, ooh, if you were carrying one of those, then you're dangerous.
Wow.
And
You're not meant to be messed with, or
you're right. And now we understand that you, with your background, could go into a gun shop and apply for a permit for a fully automatic weapon. Fully automatic means you pull the trigger once and all of your bullets come out at the same time with one pull of the trigger.
wow.
And most people would believe that that is illegal. It is not illegal. You have to have the right permit for it.
Okay.
And it doesn't mean they have to be in the military or police.
Okay.
Average citizens. There's a great video. They have a club in Arizona. You can YouTube this.
Okay.
Where they actually go out there and show all the different guns and they blow things up and shoot all sorts of stuff. Long story short is today, let's take the state of Texas, we have about 50 million guns just in the state of Texas. So you would probably think, well, we got a lot of people in Texas. Well, we have about 22, 23 million people total. That includes kids. And only 40%, up to 40% of households actually have a gun in it. So we're talking about 50 million guns in the state of Texas alone in the hands of about 40% of the population. Now, why do they need all those guns? Well, the gun industry, gun lobby, got those guns into the hands of a specific demographic
Okay.
when the Supreme Court, although they said it twice before, that no, you can't own a gun just because you want one. But it wasn't until Scalia, who's now deceased, Supreme Court justice, said yes, that law changed. And the gun lobby then started to target a certain demographic, and it wasn't African-American males. I can
Okay.
tell you that.
Wow.
Okay? And so all of a sudden, these guns start pouring into our community. Countrywide, we have about 350 million guns, again, in the hands of about 40% of households. So you tell me in terms of whether or not this means something. I'm just giving you the information. You can come to your own conclusion.
This is heavy.
Yeah.
This is heavy. I want to say that does this have to do with, southern states being, I should say that you can, it's like, well, if you were, it's, I don't want to, this is just quote unquote, I don't want to, say things, but it almost appear as if they're trying to say, well, you can have this, and if you encounter somebody that is a threat to you, basically just deal with them accordingly. Because it's almost as if they get to protect themselves, right? Because they have majority of the white population has access to it, you can say. But I mean, a lot of people in Texas now, they own a gun, but you can definitely know that majority of them are gonna be white. So now they have that more accessible to them. For people of color, when they encounter them, it almost as if it's easy for you to take a life. It's not even a police officer that needs to do it, because we see our different cases that's going on right now. So it's
Well, let's talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about gun violence.
Right.
I think more of us are learning about Tulsa, Oklahoma, back in 1921.
yes.
I want us all to learn more because they're getting ready in July to start to excavate what they believe may be mass graves. It is one story in our story during the so-called Jim Crow
Yes.
era. I don't want to get into that because it'll take up another segment.
Okay.
However, or they believe about 300 people were killed during that massacre. They actually used what they call a Tommy gun, the old gun where you kind of crank it like this and you do this and the bullets come out. It's the first kind of automatic weapon, I guess, used in World War I. We are a very violent culture, but it's always been violence really to control a certain other demographic. So, that is to say, this is a true story. I had someone come in and put more secure locks on my door because I knew I was going to do this podcast. I may need more security. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh man.
However,
By all means, go ahead and do what you have to do to protect your life. We need you.
he was honest, my locksmith, in sharing with me the guns he had because when the government gets out of control, he was ready. This is a guy who was just there to put my locks in. He's very candid about why he has guns. I work with someone who said his mom has about 100 guns. His mother. So I hope Thanksgiving goes well over at his home, by the way, because I don't want to see her get upset.
Yeah.
But there's something going on that we need to be aware of.
Yeah.
And it is not this little innocent, oh, it's my right to have guns kind of thing. There's more to it than that.
To it than that.
Yeah.
Wow, that's extremely, it's crazy. That's crazy to think about. It's crazy to think about. Wow, we've dived into so many, so many subjects when it comes to racism. Now I'm just kind of curious, how do you guys see change coming about? I know right now we're protesting, but a lot of us can, not most of us are going out there and protesting with the protesters, which obviously, power to them. I'm protesting in my own way by talking about it, by trying to educate our, population and audience. Now, how do you see change going, how can we go about real authentic change? Like, I know this is going to be harder than, we think because the whole system is corrupt.
Right.
So how do you, I know earlier not earlier, but on our last podcast, you did mention, I did ask about politics, and do you feel like our, Black communities should get involved more into politics? But again, that's just one part of it. In schools, teachers that are teaching your children about racism. There's so many different areas that would need to be wiped out, and just we would have to reconstruct the system into a better. Like, how do you guys see that change coming about? Because it's a lot of work to be done. It's just a lot. But where do we start?
You want to take that? we need a teacher here.
That's a very good question. If you just, I guess, take it from, from an institutional standpoint, you look at our educational system, ultimately there's an issue with the curriculum.
Okay.
So, one area to address that is, we need more representation on curriculum committees so that we can have more influence on the types of resources that our children are provided or, being used to be instructed. And I think we also do need more, this is kind of a tricky thing because, we can have more, minority educators, but if they're teaching the same materials, you kind of end up with the same results. So there has to be a change there.
Okay.
And there are things that people can do on an individual level as an educator. Yes, you have this curriculum here, but you can bring in information to your students to help them better understand more about themselves, if that makes them sense. And this isn't just for Black students, because ultimately this is also pertaining to, students of all ethnic diversities, because we all kind of play a part in this picture. We can't just put the responsibility on the Black community to fix racism. That's too, it's been too big of a burden.
Yeah.
And so, definitely if you were to look at the educational standpoint, teachers can bring in, information, can teach their students about, the full aspects of American history, both black and white. On an individual level, and let me just say this, so, I'm a social worker. So social work practice is on a micro, meso, and macro level practice. So I'm a micro level practitioner, and so I, counsel people that, struggle with things like this. I've been receiving more calls about people that are particularly requesting to have a person of color as their therapist. And so I think definitely providing support in those ways can be helpful in helping to strengthen the community and strengthen people individually. On a community level, I think it is important for more, underrepresented racial groups to become politically involved. And Antonio can provide his perspective about, very, more effective ways to go about doing that. And then on a macro level, we have to have policy change. We have to have policy change because that's what's going to change people's behaviors eventually, if that makes sense.
Yes.
The beliefs part, that's going to take time, but the behaviors, making people accountable for their behaviors, we have to have that policy change.
Definitely.
So, 400 years, huh?
It's a lot.
How do you fix 400 years? We've made some gains, obviously, since 1865, but we have a long way to go. And you've heard of, race-neutral policies. We are so far behind as a group that we can't just create an education system that educates all kids equally. We need more to bring our kids up to a place where they can now compete economically, you name it. So I know this is, in some circles, a dirty word, but we have to look at what reparations could do to help bring black and brown people up to where the average white person is in this country. At that point, then we can start to look at, okay, so if we educate all of our kids and give them all the same information, they all have an equal opportunity to succeed. But if we change that entire system today, that still ain't gonna happen for black and brown folk. We're too far behind, generally speaking, right? There are some of us who are doing well.
Yes.
That's not enough. The vast majority are not.
Okay, so to kind of tie it in, quickly, I wanted to mention this, but I think this is the perfect time to mention it.
Wait a minute, you mean we'll have another hour to do that? I'm disappointed.
No. I was gonna address the Juneteenth, right?
Yes.
Is that how my accent is extremely big, but I said big, but yeah, it's strong. But I was saying Juneteenth, right?
Yes.
And it's been 155 years since the emancipation of proclamation, in Texas. It's crazy how to say that slavery was still happening here 2 years after they've already signed it. But now there is this big, huge campaign on making this a holiday. And also people of color are trying to come together and support each other's companies. Do you see that as being one of the changes that can kind of help us elevate, or try to at least change us and put black people in positions of, I want to say power, because when people think about money and wealth, they think power. So do you feel like supporting each other's businesses and trying to kind of advocate more on pouring into our black community's businesses is also going to be part of that change? What do you think about that?
It will be part of that change, but again, it won't be enough. I'll be honest with you.
Okay.
If you just look at the last 150 years and look at the protests,
Yeah.
the people will tell you where they are,
Yeah.
how they feeling.
Oof.
And there are still people who don't get it
Yeah.
and may never get it.
Okay.
So when you talk about businesses, we know, for instance, they just spent literally trillions of dollars at the federal level, mainly to prop up large corporations. And then when you look at the businesses, the small businesses that were able to take advantage of the PPP, I think is what they call it, you still look at minority businesses, black and brown businesses, got less money, right? And so we have a banking system problem, right? It is, again, when you build it to work, it was working exactly the way it's supposed to, by the way. This is the way it's supposed to work. Except we're saying now, we're not accepting this any longer.
Right.
That's the only difference. But it was designed to work exactly this way. So what we need is to have a change in the design, how things work in this
Gotcha.
country.
Gotcha.
And it is a heavy lift, but what are our options?
Wow. Thank you so much for getting that a lot more clearer for us. And I think we do have a lot of work to do. And it's going to start with, all of us in what we do individually in our lives and how we, contribute to that change. But we do have a challenge of the day, a challenge of the week. So point of view, it's sad to say we're coming to the end of this conversation, although I feel like we have so much more to talk about. But I love how you guys both eloquently educated us and gave us a lot more into, the depth of the psychological trauma and, into the, the forced policing. How can we see change? And I think these are kind of conversations that we need to have more so that we can kind of keep educating ourselves and other people. I know that there are some, if you have white friends, how can we help them kind of, educate them as well? Because they are not taught, they're not teaching, they're not hearing about that. They never see that. Some of them are kind of racism, they're racist, but they're blindly racist. So it's like they don't even realize that they're actually racist because it's something that's also been passed down to them. So we have to also practice kind of like try to understand that if someone wants to learn, I want to also, that's my challenge of the week is I wanted you guys to have the challenge of the week, which I also will allow you to give us a challenge of the week. But my challenge of the week is that if you see someone that is not, someone that looks like you or someone of color, and it's a white person that wants to learn or someone else that wants to learn about racism. Someone else that wants to learn and you don't just push them away. You also educate them. If they're willing to learn, that's the most important thing. You educate them and make them understand what's going on and how they can also be a part of the change. Do you guys want to add to the challenge of the week?
I do. So one challenge of the week that I would say is that I think it's important for people to be able to have a space. You mentioned, being able to talk about it and have a space to be able to share how they feel or to provide other people the space. And I think that's important, especially when it comes to internalizing how you feel and being able to cope with it in a healthy way. And so I think we need to talk about these things so we can better understand each other. And I want to add to that challenge of the week for you.
Yes.
My challenge for your white listeners or listeners of other ethnicities, my challenge for them is to learn more about racism. Don't allow that to be, in a sense, an African American's, responsibility, because for a large part, many of us have experienced, discrimination. And so I know for myself, seeing a lot of the things that are happening is very triggering for me. Yeah. And so from a psychological standpoint, in addition to being a practitioner, sometimes that's a lot. So I think that we all need to kind of share in this responsibility of better understanding racism, because this is everyone's America.
Definitely. Very well put. I love it. And thank you guys. I'm so grateful that you both agreed to do this. You don't know how much, I have so much gratitude right now. And I love that we're able to kind of freely share our thoughts. And for you guys listening, thank you so much for rocking with us still. And with this, during this time, we're still in COVID time. So please make sure that, you keep washing your hands and wear your mask when you're out right now. We're in a safe space. We did wash our hands. We came in with a mask. So just so you're not worried about what's going on. But yes, guys, try to, rock with us, keep listening, keep sharing. Do like our page on Instagram, Point of View Podcast. If you have any questions, if you've actively done a challenge of the week and you would like to share it with us and share your experience, please start sending your emails. I would love to read some of those challenges and how you've incorporated into your lifestyles and to kind of share it with our listeners to kind of see how you guys are growing in your daily lives. Thank you so much once again. If you guys have any platforms that you would like our listeners or our viewers to kind of find you on, you can go ahead and say it now. I don't know if you have Instagram, Facebook. We can go ahead and put it. I know you gave us your email last time.
I don't really want folks to find me.
It's okay. We'll keep you in security. But what about you, Shaquita?
I'm not as active on social media, but I need to change that presence. But we'll stay in touch.
Okay, we'll stay in definitely
Yeah.
we'll stay in touch because
Yeah.
I definitely will need you.
Yeah.
But once again, guys, thank you so much. Until next time, keep watching with us. It was the Point of View podcast with Obel. Bye.
Thank you.